Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on cost of living. On behalf of all of us in the office today, I'd just like to start by acknowledging and paying our respects to the First Nations custodians of the land where our legal aid office stands today in Brisbane CBD, where we work to help disadvantaged Queenslanders uphold their legal rights in our justice system. We pay our respects to their elders, law, customs and creation spirits, and we recognise that these lands have always been places of ceremony, teaching, research and learning, and acknowledging the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play in our community and improving our legal system. And we'd just like to thank everybody for joining from your land where you are linking in from online today. As mentioned, today's webinar is on cost of living pressures and your legal rights. My name is Catherine. I'm in the Community Legal Education team. I'm just going to be going over a few housekeeping notes before handing over to our two lawyers this morning. We've got Christy sitting next to me, and I've got Paul here, who I'm sure you will all recognise from our webinar last month when Paul covered natural disasters and a legal Q&A. So as I said, just some housekeeping slides. Our webinar is recorded today. It will be captioned and published on our YouTube channel. It is intended for community workers, support workers, financial counsellors and community lawyers. You are more than welcome to share it with your professional networks or use it as a training tool in your office. It's not intended for the public, just for workers who are helping clients to connect with Legal Aid Queensland or looking for the legal information on cost of living and things we're covering today about mortgages and rates and body corporate. If you do need any technical support, please download the handout if you are able to. And we have a link in here to the GoToWebinar customer support, which is the technology we use to be able to run our live webinar. And similarly, above the handout section or just below on your own screen, you'll see a questions box. You're welcome to type questions in at any point of the webinar today. We have a really amazing list of questions from you all ahead of the webinar, so thank you so much for providing those. We will be framing our webinar a little bit differently today. Our presenters, Paul and Christy, have done some really comprehensive slides for you that you can use as a handout. There's a lot of really valuable information in there. I really encourage you to download that now. There won't be time to cover all of the points within that. There's some really great case studies that you'll be able to read in your own time. Because we've got so many valuable questions, we are going to be framing today's session as more of a Q&A. All right, and those who have attended our webinars before know that we love polls. So if you don't mind, we are just interested to know who we've got with us today. This is a way for Paul and Christy to be able to get to know their audience. I can see we've got a lot of financial counsellors logging in today, a lot of social workers and community legal centre lawyers. And a lot of people who have ticked the other box who might be a health worker, or a education worker, a community worker, a GP and such. Thank you to those who have had the time to answer it. I'll just close that down, and for your own interest, share those results with you as well. Our next poll we would like to run today is just helping us to understand where you're linking in from. Are you working from Southeast Queensland, far north Queensland, regionally or outside of Queensland? We do actually have a good number of people from outside of Queensland today, so Paul and Christy, do you mind just letting our audience know as we move through where the law is relevant to people from other states within Australia, or where it's specific just to
Because
people
some of the
in
discussion
Queensland?
will be relevant to right around the country, and some of it will be very specific to Queensland.
Yeah, fantastic. And so Paul and Christy will be able to let you know as we go through, and you can always put your hand up and ask a question if you're unsure too. So I'll just close that poll off and share the results with you. We've got half of our attendees today from Southeast Queensland, and it's just fantastic to see a lot of people linking in regionally as well. So thank you all for coming today.
In a lot of ways, this next poll is a bit obvious, but it's an important question still to ask.
Definitely, Paul. Yeah, we're interested to know how often you help clients who are struggling to meet their financial obligations due to the cost of living increase that we've been seeing over the last couple of years.
Frequently.
Yeah, and yeah, we're at about 90% of you are saying frequently. And Paul and Christy have developed some really great slides that will give you some really good core information to take away and be able to help your clients with today. So just a reminder to download those as well. And this just helps Paul and Christy as well understand your level of knowledge. Because we're an online audience, it's a great way for us to be able to get to know who you are, who's on the other side of our computer screen.
All right, Christy.
All right.
How are we going?
So I'll talk to you briefly about what we're going to be discussing today and what you might learn from the hour session that we will try and get everything in jam-packed for you guys. So we're going to talk about what your legal rights are as someone who may have been impacted by the rising costs of living, and how we can support those people in our community. So today we're going to talk about how clients can manage inflation and the costs of living increases that we're seeing, financial hardship provisions generally, and how to negotiate those types of variations with lenders or service providers. We're going to also talk about the common legal issues that we are seeing at Legal Aid Queensland, and how you can get free legal assistance from us. As Catherine said, our slides, we're not going to have enough time to go through each and every one of them, but we're very happy to take questions along the way, and we can talk about all of that. So in regard to the cost of living pressures that we're seeing and how to manage them, we are definitely seeing a lot of mortgage stress from our clients that present to legal aid. We're seeing definitely a lot of accrued rates accounts with local governments where there is unpaid rates for a period of time.
And what we're thinking, the key bit there though, Christy, is that's probably an early warning signal that there's more mortgage stress on the way.
Yeah, definitely. So if there's those unpaid rates accounts, there may be other accounts that are in the future going to be impacted as a result.
And that's because people tend to prioritise the mortgage at the moment, don't they?
Definitely. And that they may be doing that without knowing that they can ask for some hardship assistance from their mortgage lender or their mortgagee. So we will talk about that. We'll also talk about body corporate. That is definitely an issue that we're seeing come up in our advice service. And
then the hit list of issues there that are all issues I'm sure people out there are seeing, Christy.
Yeah, definitely. So everything on that list. So we've got credit contracts, secured car loans, small out loans, utility bills, and definitely buy now, pay later products. And especially in circumstances where clients may have multiple buy now, pay later lenders that they're trying to negotiate.
So let's dive into mortgages.
Yeah.
And you thought you'd escape the polls, but we just want to test some knowledge about where everybody's at. And the financial counsellors on screen or with us, I'm sure will know this one quite readily. But for those community workers out there, have a go.
Yeah, and I'm going to read it out because it doesn't all fit in our back-end system. So before I share it, I'll just read the full question. It's an example. Amy and her partner Todd are falling behind on their mortgage repayments and they'd like to apply for financial hardship. What could their hardship variation look like? A reduction in mortgage and interest repayments, possibly a pause in making repayments, or a special request that will reasonably help them repay the loan, or potentially be given time to sell their home themselves rather than being taken by the bank and the bank selling it. Or perhaps any of the above could apply. Just interested to know what you guys think here. We have some mixed results, definitely top heavy on one answer, but we do have a couple of answers in here as well. And I can see most of you have voted, so I might just close that off now and share the results. Most believe that any of the above could apply. However, we did have other answers on the others. And Paul and Christy, I wondered if you'd be able to talk a little bit more about this for our audience.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely any of the above could apply. A hardship variation would look like a reduction. It could be a pause. It could be a special request that the client might think would be suitable to their situation, and definitely time to sell the secured asset or the home.
And I think you've hit on the key point there when you said suitable to the client.
Yeah.
Often you see banks or lenders make hardship offers that are cookie cutter, will give you 3 months off without having to make a payment. And that doesn't always work for an individual client, does it?
No, at the end of the 3 months, they're going to have a pretty hefty arrears bill that would need catching up on. So it's really what's going to work for that client in those circumstances.
So let's set some context here. There's how many interest rate rises in a row are we up to? Is it 12?
I think it's around there. Yep, 11, 12.
11, 12.
There's a few.
There's, I think the last figures I saw, 800,000 people coming off fixed, or 800,000 loans coming off fixed rates in the next few months.
Wow.
And there's power bills going up.
Mm-hmm.
There's utility going up. There's food going up. All of that's going up, so people are struggling. If somebody comes in the door and we work very closely with financial counsellors, so they might come in our door, they might come into a financial counsellor and say, I'm struggling with my mortgage. How do we go about it?
So, most of the time, clients that present don't actually know that they can ask for this kind of assistance from their lenders and may just be struggling. So, that client would definitely benefit from some financial counselling. Paul said we work very closely with financial counsellors, so doing some budgeting, presenting what arrangement might be suitable for that particular client and what could be presented to the lender or the service provider as a meaningful and appropriate variation under hardship.
Because the key bit there is people don't think this is a legal issue, do they?
No.
They think this is money, and money we shouldn't go talking to lawyers, because usually you have to pay lawyers money.
Definitely.
And that's not something that people are very keen on, understandably, when they're in financial trouble. So I think this is the key bit, one of the key bits of this webinar, reminding clients out there that they have legal rights to ask for this stuff. It's not just something that's just there that the banks are being nice about, although they do try. There are legal requirements that they have to consider when you're in financial hardship, how they can reasonably help you as a lender.
And Paul, these clients as well, they can come direct to yourselves for a free initial meeting or appointment as well, and ask their questions direct.
Yes, legal advice from Legal Aid is free on these issues, absolutely. And I guess the other thing to think about in that is it's not just mortgages. It's like car loans, it's credit cards, it's personal loans. All of those things are relevant to people asking for help.
Phone and internet bills.
Let's just break it up for a minute, because this is one of the common misconceptions of clients out there. Because banks and lenders have these particular legal obligations to assist with hardship, everybody must have the same obligation. And unfortunately, that's not true. So we'll break that down a bit, but let's finish off with come back to that. Let's finish off with the banks.
And Paul, Can I jump into one of the questions here that's relevant to what you were mentioning earlier about the consecutive interest rate hikes? Someone in our audience has asked, given the impact of these consecutive interest rate hikes, do banks plan to take a more flexible approach to hardship cases?
Look, I would think yes. And the evidence I would point to there is how they handled COVID.
Mm.
There was a lot of flexibility given to a lot of people when COVID hit and the economy was struggling, and a lot of effort made to try and keep as many people on track as they possibly can.
Mm.
Is it likely you'll again get 12 months without having to pay anything at all? What do you reckon, Christy? You reckon?
Maybe not.
But I think they're open to hearing circumstances and ideas
Mm.
that would work for your individual clients.
Mhm. And for someone who may not necessarily want to go down the path of applying for hardship, but are struggling to keep up with their repayments, or would like to just simply negotiate a better rate because they have the option to try that, how would they best go about negotiating a lower interest rate?
There's a couple of difficult questions here, though. The first is you can't really ask for help without applying for hardship, just more generally.
Mm-hmm.
But if you apply for hardship, what's the consequence for your credit report now?
So if you are getting a hardship variation to your loan, that's going to be on your credit report for 12 months. That's something new that's came in. So understandable clients might be reluctant to be asking for help in those circumstances.
So that leaves negotiating.
Yeah.
Does that work for people in financial trouble usually?
In terms of the interest rates?
Yes.
Yeah. So not exactly.
Yeah, and yes, we are typical lawyers. We don't give you a straight answer.
In terms of negotiating interest rates, it's going to be something. I don't think a hardship variation would be something where your interest rate would be changed. It would be more like your reduction or a pause or things like that.
Or putting your ears on the end of the line.
Yeah.
Is another option.
Yeah. But in terms of negotiating interest rates, it may just be a bit of seeing what's on the market and having those conversations with the lender.
And what's the problem if you want to refinance when you're in financial trouble? What do banks have to do?
Show that you can service the loan, which again might not be appropriate.
Well, it's not so much inappropriate, it's they have responsible lending obligations.
Yes. Might not be suitable.
Yeah, so refinancing might not be suitable if it puts you in financial trouble. And I noticed one of the financial counsellors is a step ahead of us, and we're getting to the point that the difficulty about refinancing when you're in financial trouble or arrears is you're not going to be able to show that you can meet the repayments going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So the refinance won't be successful because the bank would be lending irresponsibly to you.
Yeah.
So that's one of the issues, and there might, although it's probably a little bit of scaremongering, there has been news reports around people being trapped in mortgage prison. And what that's actually saying is once you're in a mortgage and you're in financial trouble, it's almost impossible to refinance.
Mm.
So that leaves you having to talk to the bank about hardship.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that's problematic, isn't it?
And then that goes on your credit report.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in a sense, entrenches the fact that you're not going to be able to refinance.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. And someone's also mentioned here they found it difficult for their clients to access a financial counsellor quickly as they would need it, because often the client won't reach out until they're already at a crisis point.
Yeah, and look, that's a case of there's no wrong door from my perspective. If somebody's struggling to get into a financial counsellor, also have them try us. Because we find people get better results when there's both a financial counsellor and a lawyer involved. That's our experience. It's not always possible.
Yeah.
But we would recommend doing it that way.
Definitely, and you also have a lot of great referrals that you can help them with for other aspects of their life as well, and it goes hand in hand with something else.
And a very interesting question coming through around which focuses on D in our poll, which is about being given time to sell. Often what happens is, rather than you being given time to sell, either the client will voluntarily give their keys up to somebody, their lender, or the lender will go to court and successfully repossess the house. If that happens, they do have obligations to sell the property at using appropriate means. Where it gets tricky is what people's version of a market value is versus what the actual market value is of the property at the time can be very different. And the issue around rock bottom prices is, particularly if your house is repossessed and the bailiff sells it, that's inevitably going to sell for less than if you sell it privately. And that's not the bailiff doing necessarily anything wrong. That's just the way it happens.
Yeah.
The added problem though about repossession at the moment is how hard is it to get a rental at the moment, Christy?
Very hard. So the client may, have no other options, might end up homeless. So in those circumstances, very important that a referral could be made to us or perhaps another financial counselling agency.
And it may actually be in people's interests to continue paying whatever they can on a mortgage, because that may actually be cheaper than rent.
Of course.
Report released late last week with some horrible figures. There was one suburb that in the last 12 months, the average rent's increased $470 a week.
Wow.
So there's some interest in keeping people in their houses and taking advantage of the hardship offers that are there.
Yeah, we actually had a question around that too, Paul. One of our members of our audience today asked if there are any limits to the amount that rents can be increased.
No, and very political at the moment, so we're going to stay well and truly out of that. You will have seen in the media there's been ideas floated about how to address those issues. Not for me to comment on what is not a legal issue, it's more a political issue. But I would recommend, there's an excellent tenancy service, Q-Stars and Tenants Queensland, who, if you've got people in trouble around rent, they provide an excellent service.
Thanks, Paul. And just while we're talking about some referrals, we had a question about referrals as well for financial counsellors or brokerage support that are available to help support families that are financially struggling. Do you have any other recommendations that could help this person's client?
I would start with both us and the financial counsellors. I'm a big fan of the financial counsellors number because I can remember it so easily. Because the National Debt Helpline I call the bond number, which is 1800 007 007, and you'll probably can now understand why I remember it so easily and why I call it the James Bond number. But that's a nice, easy referral.
Thank you, Paul.
And there's a question comes through about banks refusing to reduce interest rates. And the reality is they have no obligation to refuse interest rates as part of the negotiation. Reduce interest rates as part of a negotiation around hardship. What I often ask for is, can we put the arrears on the end of the loan and extend the loan if we can show after some time with reduced payments that we can meet the new payments when they're falling due. And that can sometimes deal with that interest rate issue.
And they're also mentioning in that question about not just mortgages, but personal loans and credit cards as well, which is what you're here today to help about, as well as mortgages. And we did have another question about freezing interest on credit cards and whether or not this would give their client a bad credit rating. So if the bank has agreed to freeze the credit card, will they have a bad credit rating?
Happy to take that one. So in terms of that particular question, a freeze on your interest on the credit card is going to come under what would look like a hardship variation. So there would be that 12-month record on your credit report about that.
And we should spruik, late last year, one of our colleagues, Loretta Creek, did a webinar on this particular issue around credit reports, which is up on our YouTube channel, I believe, Catherine.
That's right, Paul. So if anyone heads to YouTube and finds Legal Aid Queensland, we have a playlist of webinars for community health and education workers. That's also targeted at financial counsellors and community lawyers as well. So please feel free to go on and find Loretta's credit reporting webinar on that to get some further information there.
And look, there's a question come through about going back to the sale of a repossessed house. I'm not aware of any legal requirements that set it at, they can only sell it for 20% less than the market value. That's nowhere in the legislation that I'm aware of.
I don't think so.
But happy to be corrected on that. But the other thing I think that's relevant in this discussion about mortgages are body corporate and rates, Kristen.
Definitely.
Because it's all interwoven, isn't it?
So we are seeing clients, as I said before, falling behind in rates and body corporates. The issue with those particular circumstances is that local governments and body corporates don't have the specific obligations like banks or credit lending providers have in terms of hardship arrangements. So there's different policies that local governments and body corporates might have in regard to when a client's in financial hardship and what support could be offered. But there's essentially nothing in the legislation that says that they need to be providing that assistance. Doesn't mean they can't ask for it.
Do all councils have the same hardship policy?
No, they're all different, of course.
And we've got, what, over 100 councils in Queensland at the moment?
Something like that.
Yeah. And even worse, body corporates. Do they have any hardship policies usually?
Well, not that I'm aware of. Could be negotiations with the body corporate, but could be difficult.
Yep. And I guess that's the thing. When we're considering this, as lawyers, we can't tell clients not to pay debts. But obviously, when people are managing their money, they make decisions about what debts they prioritise. And often we see clients make decisions to prioritise the mortgage when perhaps they could be asking for hardship and prioritising other debts that
absolutely
might be harder to find hardship on. One of the other things we haven't talked about yet in that space is mortgage relief loans.
Yes. Yes.
And that is a government program.
Yep. So a client could present to the government to ask for a mortgage relief loan. My understanding of that is that the debt owed needs to be under 20,000. Is that right?
Yep.
20,000, and essentially that's money from the government you get in regard to either outstanding rates accounts or an outstanding mortgage debt that needs to be fixed up, and only in circumstances where the home's at risk of being seized and sold.
Yeah, which is often our clients. And similarly, there are other options for loans on body corporate and council. And many of you out there would have done interaction with the Great Mills program, which is no interest loans scheme program that's out there, which does in some cases allow for loans to pay rates and body corporate. And if you go to the Mills website, they will direct you to a local Mills provider to have that assessed. That's a great program that gets run. But I guess where this problem meets its head is often hardship is focused on the short term, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And does that always fix our client's problem?
No, because there's going to be long-term financial hardship dependent on the client's circumstances. Something might happen at work where they're not able to go back to work for some time, just as an example. So there's definitely circumstances of long-term financial hardship.
Yep.
There's no limit on how many times you can ask for hardship of lenders and creditors. So,
and occasionally the banks, we've had banks pay council rates, haven't we?
Yeah, so we have seen circumstances where clients can go to their bank and say, hey, I have this debt with the council wants to sell my home. And those clients have been successful in adding that debt on the mortgage, satisfying the rates accounts and staying at the home.
We've just had a question that's come through too. Sorry, Paul, to cut you off. Chrissy and Paul, do you have any tips for people to share with their clients when legal action is already underway for body corporate?
If the body corporate hasn't agreed to hardship, pay the money. Because while the money's owing, they can continue with the court action. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you.
Because the bit to just finish that off is there is a body corporate and community management complaints area that's run by the government.
Yeah.
But it can't make decisions about debt and body corporate as part of its final process. So that process, which you would use if you had a dispute about whether the body corporate was doing its job properly, for example, or they may not have let you have a cat in your body corporate, you can't easily go to them for a debt dispute.
Thank you, Paul and Christy. We've actually had a few questions come through for specific types of audiences as well, and I can see some consistency with people who are suffering from domestic and family violence. So I might touch on a couple of those questions if that's okay.
Sure.
The first one is, are there any lenders who take client circumstances into account when somebody does have a bad credit rating or a damaged credit rating because they have been in a domestic and family violence situation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, clients can enter those negotiations with their lenders about that, can communicate what has happened to them on a brief level, and those credit ratings can be removed. Happy to take referrals from anyone if that is the situation. We can provide that advice and help the client through it.
We do actually, Christy, have a situation where somebody has a debt related to domestic and family violence, and their debt is with the Department of Housing. Do you have any tips to share with the community worker that has this question to pass on to their client?
That particular debt relating to Department of Housing, I think I would refer that to Q-Stars or Tenants Queensland for that advice.
But back to DV for credit. There's been a lot of work done in that space by a lot of lenders, hasn't there?
Absolutely.
So I always reckon the first question to ask is of a lender is, what's your family and domestic violence policy? And just see what they say. Because there's a lot of the lenders have very specific policies, particularly the major banks.
Yes.
And the Australian Bankers Association actually has guidelines about how they'd like their member banks to deal with those sort of issues, which banks have adapted. So does the Insurance Council actually about insurance.
And Paul, is it a situation where those banks can not only help you with financial hardship, but also help to connect their clients with counselling or family and domestic violence support to make sure they're safe and secure, as well as just helping with the financial side? Absolutely.
Really important service that they provide.
That's great to know. Thank you for sharing that. We've just had someone who's got a client with a notice. They've been served with a notice to leave their property. Are there any tips you could share with us, Paul and Christy, on this?
Are we talking a warrant, do you reckon, or just a notice to leave?
Maybe
we've just got another. Yeah, we've just got another line here with a bit more context from this member of our audience. It's regarding when legal action has been taken for body corporate, and now they've received notice to leave. I imagine they haven't paid their body corporate in this situation.
I think the same answer as before. They need to pay the debt to get out of that particular situation.
And then if they can't pay the debt, it'll either be a notice to leave saying you've got 14 days to leave, or it'll be a bailiff's warrant saying if you haven't left the property within X number of days, we'll come and remove you.
Yeah, which may incur some further expenses, especially if belongings are left behind. There might be some bills for some storage fees of those.
The problem with that being, where do you go?
Definitely.
And so important to link up with crisis accommodation type services in that example. Because
Definitely.
I think I saw figures, the rental vacancy in Brisbane dropped again by another 0.5% in the last little while. So it's, I think the vacancy is I want to say 1.2%, but don't hold me to that. It was released very recently and it is very low.
Thank you for that, Paul and Christy. We've had another couple of questions around specific groups of people.
Sure.
One is around seniors, one is around students. So we might start off with the question around students in public schools, if that's okay. Is there any information you're able to share with our audience today about how to support students learning by understanding their financial difficulties and poverty in public schools?
The Money Smart website is definitely a good resource to be checking out. I would recommend that. And also it's important, as we were saying at the beginning, that people actually know their rights. So in those situations, the students as well as parents of those students should be coming to us or financial counselling services for that assistance in those circumstances. But definitely would recommend looking at the Money Smart website.
And like the common issues for students that I want people to be across are cars, telephones, internet are usually the big three. With cars, getting it checked to make sure it's actually a working car is a good start. You see so many students buying a car and it breaks down straight away.
Yeah.
And what they don't understand is if they've got finance and the car breaks down, do they still have to pay the finance?
Still got to pay it, yeah.
So that's probably the number one tip for students.
Yeah.
My number two tip for students is don't buy a phone and give it to your mate. Because once the contract's in your name, if the mate loses the phone or decides not to pay you, you still got to pay. And the problem with that is you end up with a default on your credit report, and that stops you borrowing for at least the next 5 years successfully because your credit rating's stuffed.
And Paul, could that also apply for students who are getting loans on electronics like televisions, laptops, any of the other things that they might need for school? iPads, I believe, are common these days.
Look, we haven't covered buy now, pay later yet, Catherine, have we?
We haven't, no. Did you want to jump into that, Paul?
Well, since we're talking about students and buy now, pay later, because I think we had somebody come to talk to us the other day who had a client that had 15 coming out on the same day.
Wow.
And that doesn't leave a whole lot of money for anything else, really. And the problem is they're easy to access. They currently don't have the same responsible lending assessments as lenders.
I've even seen them incentivised. Use Afterpay or a buy now pay later company and you'll receive a certain percentage off your purchase.
Wow. There may have been over the weekend a particular day for a particular buy now pay later provider that a number of shops were advertising as a way to encourage people to purchase and buy. Just because it's easy doesn't mean you should do it. And that's hard for students and that's hard for young people. But you don't fall into the trap of multiple different buy now pay later products. You've still got to be able to afford it and the basics as well.
Of course.
And I see a question from a financial counsellor I know well through that she's seen. She and I have both seen this a lot. We were mentioning consumer leases. If somebody consumer leases a phone or any other product, they don't actually have ownership of it, and so they can't do things like pawn it or sell it because that gets them in significant legal trouble. But let's say a lender says, nah, we're not giving you financial hardship, and you think it's reasonable that you should get it. What do you got to do, Christy?
So that could be a ground for a dispute. So initially you would be taking that particular complaint to the provider's internal dispute resolution department. There is some tips we've provided on the handout and on the screen there right now about what you can raise during those types of disputes. If it's the case that the provider or the lender is not willing to hear you out during the internal dispute resolution process, and they either don't give you a response or they don't give you the variation that you think is appropriate or suitable to your circumstances, then there's the opportunity to pursue a complaint elsewhere, so by way of external dispute resolution. And depending on what kind of contract we're negotiating, there's different avenues which we can talk to in a moment. But generally, yes, that's a basis for a dispute, which clients may not know about.
And if IDR if IDR doesn't change their mind, we're off to Africa, aren't we?
If it's a credit contract or something like that, yes, we are.
Australian Financial Complaints Authority. Apologies to the audience. I always speak in acronyms and forget not everybody might know them. What if it's a telco debt, Chrissy?
So there is the telecommunications TIO.
Yep.
I think we've got all of the information for those ombudsman schemes at the end of the slide, so you can go onto their websites and have their contact information there.
Yeah, and a very good point coming through on the questions around what buy now pay later is being used for. It's being used for basics. People are buying food with it. They're finding ways to pay utilities with it. They're finding ways to pay phone bills with it. And if people are in that position, that's not healthy.
It's an alternative to a credit card that doesn't have the same regulation.
At the moment, that's right. There is currently consultation by the government about whether buy now pay later should be regulated like all other credit products. And we did a submission on that point. And as I understand it, the government's currently considering that position.
Oh, well, that's great to know, Paul. We might jump backwards a little bit and delve into the question that relates specifically to seniors, if that's okay. Sure. We've had so many really fantastic questions that are coming through. So we're going to be jumping back and forth to make sure that we can include and cover everybody's questions today. Do you have any resources off the top of your head you could recommend for people in current financial hardship provisions that relate to senior clients?
Look, the thing for me about seniors is the answer depends on whether they have assets, usually. Because we see a bunch of seniors who have very large credit card debts and no assets.
Yeah.
And they're on a pension.
Not really any real ability to pay that back.
And do banks usually respond fairly well to approaches about that?
My experience is yes. Yes, they do.
And how do they usually respond?
So by way of entering some negotiations about perhaps a waiver of that debt on the basis of the inability to pay. Because as Paul said, if you're in those circumstances on the pension, not receiving much money, no assets, there's no real change of circumstances that's going to happen to allow those accounts to be paid. So banks are responsive to those waiver requests.
which is really important. Whereas if they have an asset,
might be a different story.
And we're seeing more and more people retiring and still having a mortgage, aren't we?
Definitely.
And so often the negotiation there is around, is it suitable for that person to have a life tenancy? And in some circumstances, it will be suitable to argue that the person gets a life tenancy and it gets sold on the person, or if there's two people at home, both people either dying or going into care.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Being aware, and we won't go into it now, being aware there are still reverse mortgages out there which cause seniors significant amounts of trouble when they need to sell the house and try and go into care. We have had people in a position where they can't afford the money that they need to pay to secure that care place because of the reverse mortgage. But that's a whole other webinar on its own.
Yeah, that's a tough situation. We might break it up a little bit with a poll, if that suits everyone. And just a reminder that you can get all of this information. There's some really amazing case studies that Christine and Paul have put together, and there's some information here about buy now, pay later with a case study as well. So as we mentioned earlier, we don't have time to get through all of the slides today, but please do download the handout.
I agree with that, and it's just worth thinking about. The tip there is where can I get easier help from that will help me through the financial hardship I'm in?
Mhm.
That's always the question for mine.
Can we jump into mortgage relief thresholds, Paul and Christy? We've had a question, and you might be able to shed some light on this acronym, Paul. HEEAS and mortgage relief thresholds have remained at the same level for over a decade. Are there any plans or discussions around lifting these thresholds? And just for myself and the audience here today, do you know the acronym HEEAS?
I'll get it wrong, and I know the audience out there will get it right on me, but it's an energy grant to help you with your power bill. It's the home, and I forget the second E, energy assistance scheme. It might be home, but it's
an energy grant. That's
great.
Grant. And that's a good reminder for our audience as well. Please try and spell everything out.
Thank you. Home Energy Emergency Assistance Scheme. Thank you. I knew my audience would have my back on that one.
All right, I'll read that question out again now that we've covered.
But the short answer is that's a question for government and government policy.
Okay. All right.
That's not something we will go anywhere near.
Yep. Okay. Great.
But the other acronym we've been asked about is HEM, the Household Expenditure Measure. And where that's come up is payday lenders in the past have liked using that. They don't anymore though, I think. Christy?
I haven't seen it for quite some time.
Yeah. So, but what is it? What's HEM?
So it's basically something that lenders might look at to determine what should be the expectation for someone's cost of living.
But it's basically a measure of poverty, though, isn't it, Christy?
Yeah.
So I'm not a big fan of it being used. It would be fair to say I've jumped up and down a lot over the years whenever somebody dares to try and use it, because the legislation is around, can people make the repayments without being put in substantial financial hardship? And if you're going to assess somebody as being on the poverty line, they're in substantial financial hardship, in my humble opinion.
I would agree.
So if anybody is using that, or you see people using that, companies using that out there, please refer.
And we did, I know you've just covered this, Paul, but I'm going to read the questions from the audience out just to reiterate this again, if that's okay. Are there any current movements towards increasing the HEM, which is grossly out of touch in their own opinion, with the lived experiences of people, particularly those living in rural and remote areas? So there are adjustments made to those measures depending on where people are. Is the short answer. Okay, so it can be location dependent. We had another question regarding HEM. How does the increasing cost of living impact on the use of HEM as a benchmark by creditors in credit applications? It would make us even more likely to make loud complaining noises about the use, because it's just inappropriate. There's an interesting question that's come through on the chat around what happens if a local council that has hardship policies doesn't engage with those hardship policies and doesn't come up with a suitable arrangement. Are there options? Because you'd usually go to IDR if they were a lender.
Yeah, you would. But unfortunately, there's not anything like IDR or EDR with rates accounts. So in those circumstances, the options may be to pay the debt, sell an asset if you can. There is an option though, I reckon. There might, and I'd have to check. There might be an option to go to the state ombudsman, because the state ombudsman usually, and I can't vouch for all states, has some jurisdiction over the decision-making process of local governments, state government departments, places like that. So that may be an option. I would have to check that. Before I did that, I would go to a higher power in the council. Because often the higher power in the council has more flexibility. And just reiterating that those particular circumstances could be a bit harsh, potentially. And because what you're trying to do, and I think this is a good takeaway from this
cost of living pressures is about showing decision makers the human side and the human effect. Because it's a lot easier to refuse something if it's just numbers on a page. It's a lot harder to refuse it if it's somebody's life and somebody's story.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the number one takeaway for us. And I know that's not a legal takeaway. That's more of a practical takeaway. But I think that's a really important thing to think about.
Definitely.
In that sort of space.
And Paul, someone's also asked if you, in your professional experience, do you see these cost of living problems that we're having as being temporary, or are they more and more becoming more normal?
My concern about COVID, and COVID I think probably accelerated this, is very much a two-speed economy out there. There's a bunch of people doing really, really well. And there's a segment who are in trouble, and it's without significant change. It's difficult to see how they're getting out of that trouble. And that makes me sad to say that, because widening gaps between rich and poor are not something that any of us, I think, want to see. But I think it's a reality of what's out there. And that does make me sad.
Yeah, of course. And for people who need financial hardship, Christy, would you be able to just clarify for our audience again what the definition of financial hardship really is, and how people can access discounts or get waived fees or have help on their bills?
Yeah, so hardship could arise when a client, is not able to, get their expenses, pay for their expenses as usual. There might be a bit of pressure. There might be absolutely no money left for food. Really, hardship could arise in any kind of circumstance like that.
But my question then is, does that definition differ between varying grants?
It would, yes.
So are we saying there's not one definition of financial hardship out there?
Yeah, that's correct. It could look different throughout.
Thank you. We might jump into understanding debts then relating to vehicles, if this is okay. So this question relates to someone who had been in a car accident where they were at fault. The insurance company required payment from them. The accident happened over 12 months ago, but the client is unable to pay their insurance company due to other debts and other living expenses they have, particularly with the rise we've been seeing lately in basic household expenses. Do you have any advice that you're able to provide someone in a situation where they simply can't afford to pay their insurer, however they were at fault for the car accident?
So I think Paul did mention before that insurers have the same kind of obligations in regard to hardship. So hardship can be negotiated in those circumstances, but also I think it's important that perhaps this may be a direct referral to either myself or Paul, because just because they're saying you're at fault, that might not actually be the case. So that could be a point to be explored by way of a referral to us.
And just to clarify though, the hardship provisions for insurers aren't in legislation. Where are they?
They are in the Insurers Code of Practice.
Yeah, so not as strong requirements on them because it's in the Code of Practice, but there are still requirements.
Still an option.
We've had another question come through, and we're actually going to have to wrap up our webinar in a couple of minutes. It's been so full with questions, which has been really wonderful to help us guide our presentation today. So we may have time for 2 more questions after this one. Paul, this one's for you in regards to bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Someone's concerned that clients may be able to be prosecuted if they purchase or obtain a credit card within 2 years prior to being bankruptcy. Do you have any information you could share on this?
Look, that's going to be very factually dependent, that one. You have obligations if you're bankrupt and applying for credit to actually tell the creditor if it's above a certain threshold amount. But to answer that question, we just have to look at the specific circumstances to give a sensible answer.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll just jump back to some of the contacts that Paul and Christy have put together for you that may be helpful to note down.
And this question coming through, and we haven't covered this, around can you access your super in financial hardship?
Yeah, definitely. So some options that we might speak to clients about, if maybe in circumstances where the home's at risk of being seized and sold, getting access to super may be an option to alleviate that particular.
And there was a report, I think it was in the newspaper last week, there was an eye-watering amount of money withdrawn from super due to financial hardship during COVID.
Yeah.
It was in the tens of billions. So yes, you can do it, but there are restrictions, aren't there?
Yeah, there might be a particular process involved with that avenue.
Thank you. Paul, this question you may have already touched on actually last month. It's going back to natural disasters and floods and insurance renewals. Somebody would like some guidance on when they have a client who can't afford to pay insurance renewal on their property or their vehicle or asset, and they're just wondering if they can negotiate different levels of home insurance, such as excluding flooding from an insurance renewal.
So the short answer is some companies only offer home insurance which includes flood, but that does not prevent somebody from going to another insurance company and saying, I want insurance that does not have flood cover.
So they can shop around one.
I would obviously seriously consider what it was, if I'm an individual, what I want to be covered for, and have a plan for dealing with the circumstances for stuff I was deciding not to be covered for.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thanks, Paul. And if you didn't make it to our webinar last month, it is online on YouTube under our Webinars for Community Workers playlist. Paul delivered a really comprehensive conversation about natural disasters and floods and dealing with the finances and insurance around that. So I would really encourage you to go onto our YouTube channel and watch that webinar as well.
So I guess we should leave with some tips. What's the one thing you want people to take away from this, Christian?
Please come to us for help. Also financial counsellors where you think appropriate. We're definitely happy to help out and take those referrals. If a decision's been made that the client may not be particularly happy with, there may be grounds for a dispute there, and we would love to take a look at it, so come and get that advice. And also lastly, just asking questions where appropriate.
Cool. And I think my two, we covered one of mine earlier around telling the story, making it human, I think is really important. And the second one is, remember, all hardship is not the same. Different industries, different companies have different approaches to it. And it's really important to engage directly with those companies.
Thank you. I just want to give a big thank you to Paul and to Christy for our conversation around cost of living today. You've got such a wealth of knowledge that I know has been really helpful for our audience based on the amount of valuable questions that we've received today. So thank you so much, and thank you for being so flexible, jumping in and out of multiple conversations today to make sure that we can cover all the questions that everyone has. And of course, without our audience, you know, we really rely on you to help frame our presentations, because our presenters always really want to provide information that you need most. So thank you for your questions. We really enjoy hearing what you have to say and your comments along the way as well. And we'll be delivering another webinar in April, so please keep an eye out. We've got a flood of thank yous coming through for you both, Paul and Christy, today. So yeah, it's really nice to see how appreciative our audience is for our webinar, and yeah, we really enjoyed having everyone here today, and we'll see you in April.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience.